ultimately reinforces that pride that we have as a family in her legacy. And it was, I think, a great legacy that she left behind. And she was a great campaigner as well. She had a forensic mind. She was a great orator and combined deep knowledge of all the issues that she engaged with. And she combined it with an absolutely massive work ethic, non-stop, 24/7. This isn't to say she didn't also get frustrated at the lack of progress on issues. In particular, I think for Ratna, it sometimes felt that campaigning on race rights issues in Britain over the last decade was a bit like running up a down escalator as hard as you possibly could, simply to get an opportunity to bang your head against a brick wall once you reach the top. She also despaired at the way funding cuts left civil society groups sometimes more concerned to fight each other for funds than to collaborate to affect social change, or indeed how it made them impelled sometimes to take money from sources such as Prevent, which she saw as deeply problematic. She was equally frustrated at the way the racial politics of the war on terror sometimes also left different minority communities focusing on their own particular interests rather than cooperating together to pursue their common interests. But ultimately, despite these frustrations, despite her sort of anger at government agendas and the inability to change them, she never gave up fighting. Largely, I think, because rage at fighting injustice was built into her DNA. She was never a 9-to-5 campaigner. And for Ratna, discrimination and injustice was something to be challenged everywhere and any time, whether in the House of Commons, the European Parliament, or in Bradford Council meetings. She was also adept at using every kind of media platform to get her message out. She produced books, wrote reports, gave speeches, and wrote numerous articles for the press. But in particular, I think, given her background in broadcasting in Singapore, she retained a particular interest in the ability of film and television to influence popular debates, and produced a variety of documentaries on issues to do with race rights. So the fact that the first award in Ratna's memory is actually going to the director of a film set in Bradford and examining Islamophobia seems particularly appropriate. And rather like the film, Ratna's work was also about human beings rather than merely abstract ideas. She connected with people, with their very human problems, and consequently she took on their fights with authority as if they were her own fights. Indeed, I think it's notable that tributes to Ratna have actually largely come from the community, from activists, or from people who worked with her, rather than from local politicians and their allies, some of whom have been notably absent from the tributes that have rolled in. None of this is to say that she wasn't also prepared to cross swords with colleagues or ruffle feathers even amongst campaigning fellow travellers. If she thought you'd adopted the wrong approach to an issue, she would let you know, and she would not mince her words in the process. But what has come through, I think, most powerfully in the tributes we have received about Ratna is the overwhelming recognition of her integrity. Whatever side of the issue people stood on, whether they were with her, whether they were against her on a particular issue, there seems to have been a widespread recognition that her integrity was never in doubt. Indeed, a not uncommon refrain in the tributes we've had to Ratna has been the phrase, "I didn't always agree with her, but..." And I think the book was actually quite important. Ultimately, whatever the financial and personal costs she had to bear, she was not prepared to compromise on the need to speak truth to power. And I think people recognised that and respected it as well. And because of that recognition and respect, she was actually able to influence agendas, influence debates, and influence people. In addition as well, I think it's also worth noting that I think, as many of you know, Ratna originally came from Singapore. She was also, quite rightly, highly critical of the failure and hypocrisies evident in much of British domestic and particularly foreign policy. And her opposition to nationalism and jingoism meant that she saw any and every international sporting event as an opportunity to support the underdog rather than the home team. She would therefore have monumentally failed Norman Tebbit's cricket test. But rather ironically for me, Ratna actually embodied the very best elements of British society and culture. Elements that need to be preserved and promoted, as this award seeks to do. She was a free thinker who preferred to side with the victims of injustice rather than the perpetrators. An activist who gave real meaning to the notion of democratic participation. A campaigner proud both of JUST's identity as a secular organisation and of its record in defending the Muslim community in Yorkshire. A true iconoclast in her politics, her activism, and even in her largely non-existent approach to fashion as well. Of course, Ratna is gone, but the fight against injustice is perennial. And we therefore need to reward and we need to recognise all those other activists, all those other people out there, the campaigners, the visionaries, who work to defend rights now under attack, to promote a better world and to promote a better understanding of our world. And we certainly are in need of such people. We have a US president who thinks there is a moral equivalence between neo-Nazis and anti-racists. According to Oxfam, 8 billionaires own the same wealth as the 3.6 billion people who make up the poorest half of the world's population. In the UK, a year ago, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission produced a report which produced a deluge of quite horrific statistics, amongst which were included the fact that black workers with degrees earn over 23% less on average than white workers with degrees. If you're black in England, you are 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. Black African women are 7 times more likely to be detained under mental health legislation than white British women. And of course, in Grenfell Tower, we saw people dying basically because they were both too poor and too ethnically diverse to matter enough, to spend enough on their safety. It can therefore feel, I think, like we are living through a time when progressive agendas are in retreat and hard-won gains for our civil liberties and race rights and social progress are all under threat. Yet, I think it's even in the midst of this litany of issues, I think it's worth remembering that progressive campaigners have actually always succeeded or have always come out on top, whatever the odds and whatever the adversity at the time. Progressive campaigners have always changed the world for the better. They got the British to abolish slavery in the 19th century. They got votes for women at the start of the 20th century. They got the British out of India, the end of apartheid, the fall of the Berlin Wall, a global ban on landmines, and most recently a global agreement on the environment, even if Trump does want out of it. Charlottesville didn't just feature neo-Nazis and the far right. It was controversial precisely because anti-racist activists turned up and came out in force to challenge them, one of whom gave her life in the process. And even Grenfell Tower, since then, has been the occasion for incredible displays of community solidarity and interfaith cooperation, which I think we can all draw strength from and draw lessons from. So, those of you here today who are engaged in the same kind of work that Ratna was engaged in. I say to you, keep the faith. Not just to preserve Ratna's legacy, but to actually keep changing the world for the better. To keep up that agenda of progressive campaigning and progressive evolution into a better world. Thank you.